You don't know which of your facts will be demolished. You don't know which of your arguments will be totally destroyed. And you're now rattled, you're shaken up, and you don't know what the hell to say, but you got to say something.
The concept that some country will dominate the world is in itself a misunderstanding of the world in which we now live.
I think it's time for this toxic, binary, zero-sum madness to stop.
In that moment, the mainstream media was populated entirely by white men from elite schools. Neither people like Michelle and I wouldn't have been on the stage.
Manipulated by flattery, goaded by tweets, his hand near the launch code when he overheats.
If he's that outrageous, then you must think half of your countrymen are just completely bonkers or more.
Whatever you want to call this system, a mafia state, a feudal empire, it's a disaster for ordinary Russians.
Having different opinions is so 20th century. This century, we have different facts.
This new populism is a scam. It's a lie. It's a fake. It has nothing.
We don't require divine permission to know right from wrong. We don't need tablets administered to us 10 at a time on pain of death to be able to have a moral argument. No.
And though I am, of course, an Anglo, I'm certainly not a Saxon.
So what I want to say to you is don't give in to the fatalism here. Don't give in to the sense that these are the great forces. We can fight these forces. We believe that we can write our own history. We believe we make our own destiny.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 30th Monk Debate. 15 years of debates. We've got a great one for you tonight on anti-Zionism. I'm so happy to see this hall filled to capacity for yet another Monk Debate. Some people thought that this debate wouldn't happen, that the risks of protests would be too great. Well, so much for that argument tonight. Others went further, though, and lobbied me, the Monk Debates, people associated with our organization, that these proceedings shouldn't happen, that our topic tonight was too divisive, our society too divided, and that this debate would cause more harm than good. So again, I genuinely appreciate you being here to support this debate, to support our shared belief that it's through more and better debate that we learn and confront difficult ideas. And we do this both to sharpen our own thinking, our own perspectives, but we also do it as part of our commitment as a free and open society to listen to each other, to debate each other, to respect each other's free speech rights. So you being here tonight is a statement. It's a statement I appreciate, the Monk Debates appreciates. Thank you again so much for standing up for our right to have this important debate this evening. Bravo. I especially want to thank the family and the foundation that are behind the Monk Debates. As I said, this is our 30th debate. We've been at this for 15 years, and it takes a very special type of benefactor who's willing to deal with, to grip controversial issues like the one that we're going to discuss on our stage this evening. This is rare in our society. We need more of this civic courage, and I think on behalf of all of us, we owe a thanks to the Monk family and the Monk Foundation for making these debates possible. Thank you, Melanie. I know Peter Monk would have loved this debate, and I wish he was here to enjoy it with us. But let's get our debate underway. Our debaters out here, center stage, arguing for our motion, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Our first debater speaking in favor of the motion is a renowned and international best-selling author of over 7 books, a war correspondent, a columnist, and a former monk debater. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Murray. Well, Douglas's debating partner tonight has come all the way from the United Kingdom to be part of this conversation. She's a celebrated attorney, an expert in international law, and legal director of the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. Please welcome Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha. Well, one great team of debaters deserves another, and here we have not disappointed. The first of our debaters speaking against the motion tonight, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is a veteran war reporter from Israel, a correspondent, a celebrated columnist, winner of Israel's top award for journalism, the Sokolov Award. Please welcome from Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy. Thanks for making the trip. Gideon's debate partner tonight is a formidable debater in his own right. He's a former anchor at MSNBC and Al Jazeera English. He's editor-in-chief of the new digital news media platform, Zateo. Please welcome to the Monk Debate stage, Mehdi Hassan. Before we go to opening statements, let's just spend a moment, a brief moment, unpacking our resolution tonight, because it's short, it's to the point, but it's also a little bit complicated. So let's try to level set on some terminology. What do we generally mean by the key words in this motion? So we're going to throw up on the screen our first definition for Zionism, conventionally defined, and I'll read it out, as the movement for self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. So I'll let you think about what anti-Zionism means in the context of that definition of Zionism. Anti-Semitism, a little bit better, I think, understood and defined. Here we have hate directed at Jewish people or cruel or unfair treatment of people because they are Jewish. That's our kind of working definition of anti-Semitism. Our debaters are going to communicate to you their own views of these terms, but let's just try to level set around these concepts when we think about how we're going to vote tonight. And that is your task now. So each of you has at your seat a voting card, an electronic pad. If you're in favor of the resolution, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you're going to press 1 on the card. It has an A beside it, 1A. If you're opposed, you're going to press 3C. So 1A in favor, 3C opposed. And as these results build, I just want to welcome our live stream participants who are joining this debate virtually in partnership with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a terrific nonpartisan nonprofit organization. Many of you know it, bravo, that like the Monk Debate supports free speech and free thought. Okay, it's time to reveal the results of our first audience vote. Let's see those now on the screen. 61% of you are in favor of the motion, 39% of you are opposed. So 61 in favor that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, 39% opposed. Now, as we do each and every debate, we're now going to ask you, are you prepared to change your mind over the next 90 minutes? Depending on what you hear from these debaters on this stage, could you conceivably change your vote? So press 1A if you're open to changing your mind. 3C if your mind is made up. So 1, I could conceivably vote differently come the end of the night. 3C, no, I'm set on this motion and I'm not going to be swayed. As we let those votes build, let's bring up our countdown clock as a reminder to our debaters to keep this debate on time. We need your help. When you see the clock count down to the final 10 seconds of any one debater's segment on stage, I want you to join me in a loud round of applause, and that'll keep us moving from one part of this debate to the next. Okay, we are ready now for the second audience vote. Change your mind, don't change your mind. Let's see those results up on the screen now. 77% say you could conceivably change your mind depending on what you hear. 23% no. So this debate is very much in play as we begin, and that's what we're going to do right now with opening statements. Douglas Murray, you're up first. 6 minutes on the clock.
Well, thank you very much, Rudyard. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Monk debates. When I was last here a couple of years ago, I just returned from the front line of the war in Ukraine, where I was with the Ukrainian armed forces. And for most of the last 8 months, I've been in Israel and Gaza, following the war there as closely as I can. And I won't go into all of the details now that I could give you of what's happening. But I would just put it in perspective in this way, first of all. What happened on the 7th of October was not just a massive attack on innocent people inside Israel. It was the equivalent to about 6,000 Canadians being massacred and burned in their homes in one day. It was the equivalent of about 1,500 of your fellow Canadians being taken hostage. You know, you would have thought after an attack like the one that Hamas instigated, that started this terrible war, you would have thought that there would be some sympathy for the world, from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would be hatred around the world erupting at the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought there'd have been an outpouring of rage at the Islamic Revolutionary Government in Tehran, but no. There was an immediate outpouring of rage against the state that had been attacked. Bring back our girls, we had 10 years ago in the war in northern Nigeria, which I also covered. Bring back our girls. No international campaign saying bring back our Jewish children. Believe all women, we've been told for years. But turns out, not if the raped women are Jews. Israel is the only country in the world which, when it's attacked, gets attacked more. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus. It moves across the centuries. When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore, so People hated the Jews for their race. And then after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state. People around the world hate them so much for it that Israelis are attacked when they have hostages taken, and this is to remember the 100 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, who, if they were given back by Hamas today, the war would be over. And they're also attacked when they rescue their hostages. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is the Jews can never win, because historically they've been hated for being rich and for being poor. They've been hated for integrating and for not integrating. They were hated for being stateless. Remember, rootless cosmopolitans, the far right used to say. And now they're hated for having a state. Today, the only really acceptable form of anti-Semitism, aside from the sewers of the far right, the only real tolerated form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. Anti-Semitism, as we've also just heard, is double standards against Jewish people, or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October the 7th? Why in a Montreal suburb a synagogue should be firebombed, as happened in November? Why there should have been gunshots against the yeshiva? Why in Toronto a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked? Why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal? Why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed? Why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized? Why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school? If it isn't anti-Semitism, tell me why just a week ago pro-Hamas protesters tried to go through Jewish areas in this city shouting not just Allahu Akbar, but, and I quote, sorry for the language, fucking filthy fucking Zionist pigs, dirty Zionist rats. Have you heard that language before? The Jews have. Now look, if you are interested in this motion, just bear this in mind. It's not about Netanyahu, it's not about this war, it's about double standards, and one question hovers over it above all. The question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you.
Thank you for that opening statement, Douglas. It's now Mehdi Hassan's opportunity to present the con side of the argument.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. In 1917, over 100 years ago, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, a card-carrying anti-Semite, a man who had denounced the evils of Jewish immigration into the UK, a man who referred to Jews as an alien and hostile people, he issued his Balfour Declaration, which promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was the first time a major world power had come out in favor of Zionism, which at the time was a pretty new and pretty controversial movement, calling not just for a Jewish homeland, but for the building of a Jewish majority state in Palestine. And yet the only Jewish member of the British cabinet at that time, a man named Edwin Samuel Montagu, adamantly opposed both Zionism, which he called a mischievous political creed, and the Balfour Declaration, which he referred to as anti-Semitic and a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. The only Jewish member of the British cabinet, that is what he said. And yet tonight here in Toronto, over 100 years later, we are being asked to vote for a motion that would damn Montagu as the anti-Semite while praising Balfour as the champion of Jews and Judaism. That's ridiculous. In fact, this entire motion tonight is ridiculous, disingenuous, ahistorical. It says, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't say some anti-Zionists engage in anti-Semitism, which I don't disagree with. It doesn't say some anti-Semites hide behind the cloak of anti-Zionism, which again, I don't disagree with. Everything Douglas listed about what's happened in Toronto, disgusting, reprehensible. Those people are shameless bigots. But that's not what the motion says. The motion says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No ifs, no buts, no caveats, no exceptions. Anyone who takes an anti-Zionist position is automatically, inherently, unavoidably anti-Jewish, an anti-Semite, a racist. That is what you would be voting for if you make the mistake of voting for this motion tonight, which I'm sure you won't do because you are far too smart and nuanced an audience to do that. You are Canadians! And I have great respect for Canadians. I say that for no apparent reason whatsoever. I like Canadians. I like Israelis. My debate partner tonight, Gideon Levy, Israeli writer, is one of my journalistic heroes. It's a privilege to be on the stage with him. But this debate fundamentally at its core, and I kind of agree with Douglas here, it's not about Israelis. It's not about Israel. It's not about Gaza. And by the way, on the subject of Gaza, given Douglas gave us some math about the death toll on October the 7th, horrific death toll, which we all condemn, I would remind you also that the death toll inflicted on Gaza, the deaths and injuries in Gaza are the equivalent, if we're going to do the ratios, of 2 million Canadians. 2 million Canadians. But that's not what the debate is about. It's not even about Zionism itself. It's about the legitimacy of anti-Zionism, whether you can be anti-Zionist, opposed to Zionism, which remember is a political ideology, a nationalist movement, not a religion, not a race, not a protected class, whether you can be anti-Zionist without being smeared, tarred, demonized as an anti-Semite. And I want to be clear tonight. You could be the most pro-Israeli person in this room tonight, the most proud and ardent Zionist here, and still vote against this motion with a clear conscience. Still vote with our side, the right side. Because this motion is not about whether you are pro-Israel or pro-Zionist. It's about whether the rest of us have the right, the freedom to take a different view on Israel, on Zionism, on Benjamin Netanyahu even, without being silenced, without being told we're racists. We're not. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'll tell you 3 reasons why. 3 reasons why you should oppose this motion tonight. Number 1, if you vote for this motion tonight, you are throwing logic, history, and the English language under the bus. Because anti-Semitism is hating Jews, the people, and Judaism, the religion. Anti-Zionism is opposing Israel, the state, and Zionism, the ethno-nationalist ideology that underpins that state. Zionism is not Judaism. Let me say that again for the people up top. Zionism is not Judaism. Right? It's a very modern, secular, political ideology movement that was founded less than 150 years ago by an atheist named Theodore Herzl, who said, and I quote, "The anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies." His words, not mine. Number 2, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing Palestinians as a people under the bus. You're telling an occupied people, a dispossessed people, to accept their own occupation, their own dispossession, meekly, in silence. Otherwise, they're racists. As my friend Yusuf Manaya, the Palestinian-American activist, says, to ask Palestinians not to be anti-Zionist is to ask Palestinians not to be. And number 3, last but not least, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing a lot of Jews under the bus as well. Not just Jews like Edwin Samuel Montagu, but Jews today. If you vote for this motion tonight, you're saying my debate partner, Gideon Levy, whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, who served for Shimon Peres, who's written for Haaretz for over 40 years, just won Israel's top journalism prize 3 years ago, he's an anti-Semite. You're saying the Satmar, the world's biggest Hasidic Jewish sect, which says it is fighting God's war against Zionism, is anti-Semitic. You're saying Jewish college students on campus, maybe some of them are your kids, members of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, they're anti-Semites. You're saying some of the most respected Jewish voices in the world, like Avraham Berg, the former Speaker of the Parliament, Miriam Margolis, the actress from Harry Bloody Potter, they're all anti-Semites. That is what you are saying. That is what you're signing off on if you vote for this motion tonight. So I have a simple solution for you all. Don't do it. Vote instead for common sense, for free speech, and the right to criticize a foreign country, the right to criticize a foreign country and a political ideology. I beg to oppose.
Thank you. Natasha Hausdorff, let's have your opening statement now.
Well, thank you and good evening. What a privilege it is to be here, stood on this stage on what I consider to be the most important topic of our age. I have to begin with a debating tip coming from a land with a culture of a rich history of debate. And that is that in debates, it is for the proposition to define the motion. And Douglas did that for you, loud and clear. Mehdi seems to think that he can redefine anti-Zionism without you noticing, but the proposition are not going to allow him to pull the wool over your eyes and conflate Zionism with politics. Who has the right to define Zionism? Well, apart from the proposition in this debate, because that's how the rules work. Would you ask a misogynist to define misogyny? You wouldn't ask a sex offender to define rape. You wouldn't ask the KKK to define anti-black racism. So why, when it comes to the Jews, would you let the anti-Zionists define anti-Zionism? No, ladies and gentlemen, no minority should have its identity dictated to it. And we have defined Zionism. It concerns the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancient homeland. Zionism is not a political ideology. Zionism does not stipulate how the Jewish state should be governed, which is what a political ideology does. It simply says it should exist. It doesn't dictate borders or the makeup of population. It does not say that Israel should be socialist kibbutzim or capitalist startup nation. Israel has exemplified both of those and everything in between. This is not about political ideology. This debate is about racism and creating a double standard where you make an exception for the Jews. Now, you don't have to support Zionism, but if you are anti-Zionist, if you are against the Jews having a state, you are against the Jews. Mehdi Hassan is lying about what Zionism is in an attempt to win this debate and to provide cover for his own anti-Semitism. We usually hear a series of lies spewed by anti-Semites and anti-Zionists in an attempt to justify their anti-Zionism, and these are the modern blood libel. They are widely believed as the ancient blood libel, that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual, as widely believed and as false. I'm going to take you through 4 blood libels that anti-Zionists rely on. Number 1, the libel of colonialism. Israel is the ultimate decolonization success story. Against all odds, after Arab imperialism, Islamic conquest, and British colonialism, the Jews indigenous to Judea re-established Israel. My family lived under Ottoman and then British colonialism in Jerusalem long before Yasser Arafat, who was born in Cairo, created Palestinian national identity in the 60s. Number 2, the libel of ethnic cleansing. In 1948, when 5 Arab armies and the local Arab population attacked the fledgling state of Israel with the stated intention of annihilating its people, 700,000 Arabs escaped the fighting. Those that remained became Israeli citizens. The Arab population of Israel has increased tenfold. This is ethnic cleansing? No. Ethnic cleansing is what happened to the Jews in 1948 when Jordan occupied the West Bank. Ethnic cleansing is what happened to 850,000 Jews expelled from Yemen, Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, where they'd lived for thousands of years. Ethnic cleansing left Arab countries Jew-free. Meanwhile, 2 million Arabs live in Israel today. Number 3, the libel of apartheid, because those Arabs that remained in Israel are now 20% of its population, the only free Arabs in the Middle East. They are represented in every area of Israeli society as mayors, army officers, police commanders, members of parliament and the Supreme Court. I served under Salim Gibran, who put both an Israeli prime minister and a president in jail. And those who propagate the lie of apartheid seek to conflate Arab citizens of Israel with Arabs living under the Palestinian Authority, who have an autonomy and should be voting for their leadership. But President Mahmoud Abbas is now in his 19th year of his 4-year term. Number 4, the libel of genocide, the reprehensible smear that maliciously accuses the Jews of perpetrating the very crimes committed against them. October 7 was the latest in a long history of genocidal acts by Arabs against Jews in the Middle East. The genocide libel inverts reality. Hamas has spent 16 years embedding its terror infrastructure in mosques, schools, hospitals, and every second house. Its central military tactic is to use civilians as human shields. And in the face of these unprecedented challenges, the IDF has taken greater measures to prevent civilian casualties than any other army in history, far exceeding the requirements of international law. Genocide is the latest modern blood libel that anti-Semites use to justify their anti-Zionism, and it is central to Hamas's war strategy. Today, its only aim is to survive, and to achieve this with international pressure on the Jews to cease their self-defense. Voting for the opposition supports Hamas in this endeavor by legitimizing, aiding and abetting their anti-Zionist aim to wipe out the Jews from the river to the sea. Don't stand with the terrorists and anti-Semites. Stand on the side of moral integrity. Stand with the proposition.
Thank you, Natasha Hausdorff. Gideon Levy, we're going to have your opening statement now.
Thank you very much. This couldn't have happened in Israel, that so many people will have so much interest and come to such an evening. I can't prevent a remark that I didn't plan to say to what Douglas had just said. To stand here today, 8 months after this war started, and to talk only about the Jewish victims, totally ignoring 38,000 people who were killed in those 8 months, totally ignoring the starvation, the destruction, the tens of thousands of children which were killed, tells the whole story. After this, you almost don't need to continue, because when you don't see the other, when you're victimizing yourself and totally ignore the other suffer, the other agony, then really we have no basis here. Now I want to get back to my... I couldn't help it, sorry. I will start with a personal note. If not Zionism, I wouldn't have been here tonight. My father said goodbye, my late father said goodbye to his parents and fiancée in the railway station of Prague in 1939. He went on a boat, illegal boat, 5 months in the sea. No port would accept them, detention in Beirut, Lebanon, and finally illegally arriving in Israel. He had no idea about Zionism. He hardly knew Judaism. He never knew the difference between Purim and Pesach until his last day. I always had to explain him, when Purim you eat matzot. No, it's Pesach when you eat matzot. But he came here to Israel, and Zionism saved him. Zionism at its beginning was a just cause which was performed with many, many mistakes and even crimes. But the idea that the Jews deserve a rescue place was the most moral idea that I could have thought at those days. But years passed by. Zionism, which nobody today in Israel knows to define exactly. Many Israelis will tell you that to help an old lady to cross the road, even if she doesn't want to cross the road, that's Zionism. But Zionism today is the scaffold, that's a word that I wrote myself and I will never know to pronounce it, the scaffolding of a building which was built already. And once you built it, you don't need it anymore. Zionism today has only one meaning, and nobody can find any other meaning. It is Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. That's the real meaning of Zionism today. I was a good boy in Tel Aviv for many years. I got Zionism with the milk of my mother. You mentioned all my sins. Yes, I was in the army. I was working for Shimon Peres. I was a Zionist until I realized that Zionism means national supremacy of one people over the other. And I cannot support any kind of supremacy anywhere. Yes, it was a nice lie to tell that the people without a land arrived to a land without a people. And we were brought up according to those stories. I heard the word Nakba first time in my life when I was 20. I saw the ruins along the street and around the roads in Israel. I never asked, where are the people who lived in those ruins? What happened to them? We had no interest for this. But you get adult, and I started to cover the occupation. It's now 40 years that I'm covering the occupation, and I cannot accept Jewish supremacy. But that's my problem. It's not necessarily your problem. What must be really understood is that Zionism, as my friend Meadi just mentioned, is an ideology. You might support it, you might not support it. Israel, the Jewish people had defined themselves already. We have a strong regional superpower, and we live in a state which is more Jewish than democratic, and the struggle should be between the two, and this struggle is still ahead of us. But Zionism finished its role many years ago. It is meaningless today, but still people might believe in it. That's fine with me. My request from you tonight is don't fall to the trap of the Israeli propaganda. The strategy of Israel in recent years is efficient and successful, and you shouldn't fall to the trap because it's finally also your problem. Not any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. Not every policeman who writes a ticket to a Jewish driver is an anti-Semite. You may be anti-Israeli in the way that you are anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, and still have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I'll tell you more than this. Israel has succeeded by this to silence any criticism. And take my word, there is nothing that Israel needs now more than criticism. Because Israel will never save itself by its own. Israel will never put an end to the occupation without you, without the criticism of the world. Thank you very much.
What a terrific set of opening statements. Thank you, all of you. This debate is off and running. We're now going to move to rebuttal. So this is 3 minutes on the clock for each of you to react to what you've just heard. We'll do that in the same order as the opening. So Douglas, you're up first.
Thank you very much. There's quite a lot to reply to there. Let me first say, Gideon, you started with a peroration about me not mentioning the Palestinian casualties. That's because I started by mentioning the war. And there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. And if Mehdi cares about the Palestinian casualties, as I'm sure he does, then tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages. Gideon says Israel needs nothing more than criticism. As if Israel doesn't get criticism. Wow, he doesn't even read his own country's press. By the way, you said the other day in an interview, Gideon, I couldn't care less about the Jewish state. So we know very well where you're coming from. Let me just say a couple of things about that I didn't get to in my opening remarks, but are important. You know, if you didn't throng the streets of this city or any other for the actual genocide going on in Sudan, not the one that Mehdi and Gideon pretend is happening, but the actual genocide going on in Sudan, if you didn't spend weekend after weekend doing that, but you did come out for the post-October the 7th protests, you're an anti-Semite. If, like Mehdi once sent a tweet condemning that, it doesn't give you quite enough smoke cover. You know, if you protested not a bit, didn't set up a tent when Bashar al-Assad was killing 6 times the number of people in a decade that Israel and all of its enemies have lost in 75 years of war, you are an anti-Semite. And I would just add one other thing. I know that the media's tried to reframe the motion. I'm not going to allow it either. You know, maybe there is somebody in the world. Pakistan was invented, created as a state around the same time as Israel. I reckon that if this debate tonight was about Pakistan, Pakistan started a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of casualties, caused a lot of casualties. But you know what? If somebody said, I think Pakistan should be abolished. They just don't have the right to a state, and although they had one set up for them many decades ago, we should abolish it. I think people would say, And then if the person said, but, oh, by the way, although I want to abolish that state, I have no problem with the Pakistani people. Please, please, of course you would.
Your opportunity for rebuttal, 3 minutes on the clock.
Thank you very much. Oof. Oof. I love the fact that Natasha started the speech by saying, our side cannot define Zionism, anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitism. So Gideon, you and I should just go check out the CN Tower, because I'm not sure what the debate's about. We're being told by the proposition that we must follow their definitions of what we're here to argue and vote about, which tells you how authoritarian that side of the motion. This debate for me tonight is fascinating because for years Douglas has been the free speech warrior and I've been the guy saying there's no right to absolute free speech. Tonight I feel the roles are reversed. I'm here to say, what happened to free speech? What happened to the ability to criticize others, governments, countries, yes, political ideologies, Natasha. Theodore Herzl would be surprised to hear you say it wasn't a political ideology or a national movement. And I just find it fascinating that Natasha made it very clear that non-Jews cannot define anything to do with this. And then Douglas stepped up and accused every Jewish protester against Israel of being an anti-Semite, which I find offensive and ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of Jews. You don't have to agree with them, remember, you don't have to agree with them. But they took their right to go out on the streets in Toronto, in DC, in New York, in London, in Paris, all over the world, in Tel Aviv, to protest against what's happening in Gaza. And Douglas, one of the world's most proud atheists, not Jewish as far as I know, just damned them all as anti-Semites. Wow, that speaks volumes about where this debate is going and who is defining what and how. As for Natasha's line and Douglas's line that if you don't support self-determination for a particular group, you're a bigot. Well, you know, we've already had a lot of votes, so I won't ask you to click. I don't have power over your clickers, but I'd love to know how many people in this room either were in the last Quebec referendum or supported it from afar. Because we're in Canada, where a bunch of people want to leave Canada and do their own thing, and I'm sure many people in this room legitimately oppose that, and no one says you're bigots towards the people of Quebec. Nobody says you're anti-French language. You're allowed to have a debate about whether Canada includes Quebec or not. And you know, my friend Peter Beinart, who is Jewish, just so Douglas will call him an anti-Semite later, as he pointed out, the Basques, the Catalans, the Kurds, the Scots, they don't have states. And if you oppose them having states, you're not an anti-Kurd bigot, you're not an anti-Scot bigot, you're not an anti-Catalan bigot. People have arguments all the time. There are 5,000 indigenous groups in the world today. According to the UN, there are 193 member states of the UN. You do the math, right? So this is ridiculous, this argument that we are being expected to believe that if you don't support Israel as it is currently constituted, with Jewish supremacy, as Gideon points out, that makes you an anti-Semite. It's an abuse of anti-Semitism. It empties at a very important concept, at a very urgent time of all meaning, in order to defend a country which, as Gideon has pointed out, and which Douglas seems to think is fine, has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
Let's reset that clock, and Natasha Hausdorff will have your rebuttal now.
Thank you. I'd like to use my time to do some fact-checking, but I only have 3 minutes, so we'll see how far I get. But first of all, Balfour. We heard him quoted to you earlier, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's be clear about that quote and what was changed, or at least misrepresented, because I think this is going to give a really strong indication for what is coming out of the opposition as a whole. We were told he'd referred to Jews as alien and hostile, in fact that he was therefore an anti-Semite. Well, I'm going to read you out the quote and you make up your own minds. He said, "Mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or absorb." So I encourage you very strongly not to take for granted what the opposition are telling you tonight. And now we come to look at the numbers, and we've heard 37 and 38,000 quoted at you already this evening, and we've only just started. Ladies and gentlemen, would members of the opposition be quoting figures from Al-Qaeda or ISIS in the way that they are quoting Hamas propaganda here this evening? These figures, which have not been verified, and which even the UN has revised down on the basis of missing information for significant thousands of these figures that have come from quote-unquote media sources as opposed to from hospitals, and that have been circulated on Google Docs where people are encouraged to enter their martyrs here. This is the methodology for compiling these supposed figures. But even if we look past that and all of the studies that have already debunked these as significantly fabricated and invented, these figures make no distinction between civilians or combatants. They do not tell you how these people have died. We know that Hamas are shooting their own civilians. We know that they are bombing fleeing civilians. We know that when Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, they kill indiscriminately, unlike the measures that Israel takes, which are targeted, precise, and based on proportionality exercises. I mentioned that Israel takes more measures than any other army in the history of war to prevent civilian casualties. Hamas's main aim here is to drive up that casualty figure and inflate it, if necessary, in order to seek to win this war through creating international pressure. And it is inextricably linked with what we are discussing here tonight, because their mechanism for doing so is not just the lies about the origins of anti-Semitism or whether Balfour was an anti-Semite, but also significantly about what is happening on the ground. That is anti-Zionism, and it is double standard against the Jewish state, which means that we know that it is anti-Semitism too.
Get in, we're going to save the best for last. Let's have your rebuttal now.
I really feel overdose of propaganda, and it really neutralized me in a way, but I'll try to manage just on a factual ground, because you were all kind enough to applaud to what Douglas said, that if only Hamas will release the hostages, the war will come to its end. From time to time, it's also good to stick to facts. And the fact is that Israel wants to continue this war with the hostages or without them. And Israel is not ready to get a deal because Israel does not want to end this war. So with all the respect, things must be more accurate than this. But I would like to speak about something which is more principled. One of the big fears that we are being taught day and night is that they all want to exterminate Israel. That if you call from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it means to send all the Jews back to Auschwitz. It is a fight over the regime between the river and the sea. Nobody who opposed apartheid in South Africa spoke about exterminating South Africa. We were speaking, or they were speaking, about changing the regime. Between the river and the sea, today there are two peoples living together under the same rule, half and half by size. There's only one thing lacking there, and this is equality. This small value which democracy cannot exist without it. And when there is no democracy, it looks like apartheid, it behaves like apartheid, and it is apartheid. Zionism stands behind it, and in order to create this new regime that we all should have been in favor of a real democracy between the river and the sea, Israel has to give up one of two, either being a Jewish state or being a democratic state. As long as there are two peoples, it cannot be Jewish. As long as there is Jewish supremacy, it cannot be democratic. So it's all about changing the regime. And yes, between the river and the sea, I would love to see one day equality. And this is the meaning of releasing Palestine. And it has nothing to do, not with the Holocaust, not with Auschwitz, and not with many other things. Right now, our cause, and it should be the world's cause, is to changing the regime into a democracy. What is wrong in this? What is wrong in wishing for an equal society?
Okay, I'm going to join the debate now and try to think of some questions that are top of mind for our audience following this fantastic back and forth. Let's begin, and Douglas, let me come to you first, because I think it's certainly, no doubt, on many people's minds to address Gideon and Mehdi's point about what is legitimate in this debate in terms of the criticism of Zionism and what is illegitimate. Well, give us a sense of your parameters here, because they're making an argument that, you know, this is a debate. We are having a debate today, are we not? So is all of this off the table? What's on the table? Give us, calibrate for us your understanding of Zionism.
Let me just reiterate, because we started this debate with a definition put up behind us on the screens, and however much Mehdi and Gideon want to reframe it, it's quite straightforward. Zionism, I repeat, is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland. Anti-Semitism is cruel double standards towards Jews and cruel and unfair treatment of them as Jews. When I wish I could say I'm amazed by what Gideon said, but I recently watched your interview on Al Jazeera where you said that when the interviewer said to you how many people in Israel agree with you, and you said you could fit them in a phone box. And that's true. That is absolutely true. You are as obscure a figure in Israeli society as it's possible to find. And I'll give you an example of why. Natasha just picked Mehdi up on an important lie. You could say it's just an elision or a mistake he made because he hadn't read the primary sources, but I cannot allow Gideon to get away with what he just said, which was an unbelievable lie. He said, Israel isn't a democracy. First of all, I don't know, maybe, have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews.
Well,
I didn't get invited into Gaza. Douglas, you said in your speech.
Let me finish my point.
But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't. Secondly, so if I was on stage tonight busily flying around the world to busily defame a democracy, I would spend a bit of time there, maybe. I would spend a bit of time there because everything you said about it, like Gideon, is totally untrue. And I'll just give one other thing. Gideon said an appalling thing just there, that this is not about annihilation. One of the heads of Hamas, 2012, kill them all the Jews, don't leave a single one. Ismail Haniyeh, 2017, children are tools to be used against Israel, we'll sacrifice them for them. Yahya Sinwar, who planned the 7th, we will take down the border with Israel and tear their hearts out from their bodies. I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, from what I've seen, which you scorn because you are an armchair journalist. I'll tell you what I've seen. When Yahya Sinwar said that we want to rip the hearts out of the Jews, it wasn't rhetoric. They did it. They mean it, and only this side wants to pretend they don't, for whatever reasons a psychologist would have to explain.
Okay, sorry, you called me. Let me respond. Let's do this.
I want to see if all four of you can work with me to work through some of the questions that are on the mind of this audience who are going to have to vote on this resolution at the end of the evening. So Mehdi, have a quick response, but then let's get focused back on this question of why do you think Zionism is a movement, a political, an ism like anti-Americanism or anti-Britishism or whatever it is? I want to hear more on that so this audience can make an informed choice at the end of the night.
Yes, but let me just deal with a few things that Douglas said, because there were a few things were said. I mean, it's amusing. I wasn't surprised at all. I came to a debate in Toronto to debate Israel with two defenders of the current government, and so far Gideon and I, correct me if I'm wrong, we could have done a long list of you're apologists for genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. We didn't do that, but we've been called liars and Hamas supporters, and I get it. Neither of us talked about Hamas. We don't support Hamas. This is not a debate about Hamas. I know Douglas wants to redefine it as a debate about Hamas. Great, good for him, because he can't actually deal with the arguments we're putting forward. All the Jews who are putting forward these arguments, they're all anti-Semites, remember. I just want to deal with one point very important here. Douglas is the great journalist in Israel. I love this. Cosplaying as a journalist, going into Gaza with the IDF. Douglas interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu in January. Douglas did not, you're very bothered by Qatar and funding Hamas.
They're your bosses.
But, well, we're talking about bosses. Let's talk to this.
You're literally paid by them. I've interviewed Qatari officials. You can go on YouTube and watch my interviews with Qatari officials. And then you can watch Douglas interview Benjamin Netanyahu, where he asked him pearls like, is there another chapter left in the Netanyahu biography? That was the strong question for that. He didn't ask Benjamin Netanyahu, why did you work with Qatar to fund Hamas all those years? Why did you prop up Hamas all those years? Why, according to today's Israeli media, did you have reports that there was going to be an attack on your citizens and completely allow that to happen? Douglas didn't ask any of those questions. Instead, he'd like to spray around Hamas at the Muslim on the stage. Douglas referred to Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister of Scotland recently, as the First Minister of Gaza. Muslim guy. And he said, quote, you said, quote, he has infiltrated our system. Given we're at a debate about anti-Semitism, I find it ironic that you are throwing out some of the most bigoted dual loyalty tropes known to man, referring to a born British Muslim politician as the First Minister of Gaza. Since he's leveled that, I have to correct it. First of all, you obviously didn't see the whole interview with Netanyahu. You'd have seen the first question was one that no one else has asked him. But anyway.
Did you ask about his support for Qatar and hostages?
Gentlemen, we're going to read...
Douglas, did you ask him about
It's
Qatari
lovely
money?
to have the Douglas and Mehdi show, but we have two other presenters on this panel that our audience wants to hear from. Don't you, audience? Yes, thank you. So let me try again with this question. I'm going to keep trying, and I'm going to come to you, Natasha. The other side brought it up in a different way. Where do the Palestinian people fit into this debate? Are they all anti-Semites because they oppose Zionism, the ideology, the movement, Israel's statehood? What's your answer to that question?
First, I think we have to acknowledge that the Palestinians have self-government. They have an autonomy. So when we're talking about, Quebec as an example, actually it's an important one so far. So it's an important one as far as Canada is concerned. Well,
let's let Natasha finish. I'll come to you next.
There is an important Canadian Supreme Court case for the secession of Quebec, which is so significant that it's said to be part now of customary international law, which deals with the question of self-determination. And it's clear that that has to take into account the territorial integrity of other states. Now, the ability of the Palestinians to self-determine in the West Bank and actually vote for their leadership in the Palestinian autonomy, and certainly after the last 16 years of Hamas building a terror infrastructure, we can see what they've done with self-governance there, but that exists. I think they have been desperately let down by their leadership, and when it comes to the question of anti-Zionism, what's desperately tragic about this debate, and what we've heard already so far, is that the opposition seem willing to fight to the last drop of Palestinian blood in order to make the case against Israel. And it's not just Israelis that are suffering as a result of that, but it's also ordinary Palestinians. If the opposition actually cared about the Palestinians, they would not be seeking to conflate Israeli Arabs and Palestinians in the way that I described earlier. They would stop propagating these falsehoods about the situation, and they would stop blaming Israel for the tragic deaths that we're seeing, because ultimately, as Douglas was describing earlier, this is the responsibility of Hamas, no one else. There's one very brief point.
One very brief point, then Gideon's going to come in.
Yes, we've heard already this utopia of a one-state solution being advanced by the other side, in contrast to the autonomy that I have described. And we saw the reality of that for anyone who was blind to the realities here on the 7th of October. This was not a surprise to anyone that listened to the Hamas leadership and listened to what is being said in the rest of the Arab world. When we're talking about the mutilation and the terrible atrocities that were committed on the 7th of October, we need to understand the history that led up to that. Even in 2002, in the lynching in Ramallah, that very famous image of two Israelis who had wandered, gotten lost. They came to the Ramallah police station in order to seek refuge there. They were lynched, and their livers were eaten by the mob that lynched them. The photograph I refer to is the individual who held up his bloodied hands into the window, and the baying crowd below went wild for that sight. That was exactly what we saw on the 7th of October, but in 2002 in Ramallah. These are Palestinians who have been educated for generations to believe that the highest calling in life is to slaughter Jews. And they are being let down by that education system that is internationally supported. UNRWA schools educated 3/4 of the terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October. 3,000 people don't just wake up one morning and decide that it's a good day to slaughter Jews. That takes time and effort and energy and indoctrination.
Let's go to Gideon, and then Mehdi, you'll have a quick reply.
In the last 35 years, I'm covering the Israeli occupation. There's not a single week that I don't go to Gaza or to the West Bank. Unfortunately, the last 17 years, I can't go to Gaza because the Israeli government does not let any Israeli journalists into Gaza. But I've seen a little bit of the Israeli occupation. Not as much as Natasha and Douglas saw, but still I saw something. To speak today about autonomy in the West Bank, really it insults propaganda. It insults any human being who just knows the reality on the ground. Autonomy in the West Bank? I mean, did you ever hear a worse joke than this? Do you know what does it mean to live under the Israeli occupation? Do you know what does it mean to wake up in the morning or to go to sleep at night with troops coming into your home, with kidnapped children, women? I don't have to get into it because you in Canada see much more than we in Israel because we are protected by our media who doesn't show us anything. I just want to say to Douglas, I'm very proud to be a single voice. You know why? Because masses in history made the biggest mistakes. From when is it a criteria if you gain a majority? I'm not a politician. You want to look like masses in history who went blindly after horrible ideologies and horrible leaders? Do you need examples from this? And those few dissidents, they are the heroes of today, not me. But those dissidents are the heroes that we admire and should admire. So from when is the fact that I am lonely as a guarantee for anything? You can go with the masses, have a nice time with the masses. I don't want to be with them. But we are running away from the subject. And the subject is still the capability to criticize Zionism. And what is unacceptable is that Zionism will be above any suspicion, any question, any remark or any criticism. There is no ideology like this in the world. Yes, in Soviet Russia, if you were not a communist, you couldn't stay there. I don't want to live in a country in which if I'm not a Zionist, and that's the situation today, I can live there. But you are out of the... You are a traitor. Where, when, and where is there a place where if you don't support a certain ideology, by the end of the day, it is an ideology? Why can't you criticize it?
Thank you.
Why? Why can't you have some questions about it?
We appreciate it.
We'll
give you a round of applause.
And
Mehdi, very briefly, because I've got a question for Douglas, very briefly.
I'll be as brief as everyone else. The proposition tonight have sprayed around the word lie and liar, so let's return the compliment. Natasha lied when she talked about UNRWA and terrorism. The UN set up an independent inquiry, asked the Israelis for evidence. I know you don't want to hear this. They asked the Israelis, she's parroting propaganda from the Israeli government. The Israeli government was asked to give evidence. They refused to give their evidence. Every Western government, including your own, Canada's, has restarted funding because they looked at the evidence and didn't see it. That's great. I get it. But as Douglas might have once said, facts don't care about your feelings. To come back to the other point of lie, Douglas says the war would end if Hamas gave back the hostages. Complete lie. The Israelis have said, even if the hostages come back, we carry on the war. In fact, I interviewed Avraham Munter's nephew. Avraham Munter's a 79-year-old Israeli hostage right now. Poor guy, tragic. 79-year-old in captivity, should be freed, of course, had to have his birthday in captivity. His nephew says that every time he goes on the streets, Ben Gvir's police beat him. They beat him and arrest him. They're arresting hostage members' families, hostages' family members. And they're coming on TV and saying, why are we being used as props by people who support the war? He doesn't support the war. He wants a deal. Israeli family members are going on the streets and being tear-gassed and water cannon, whatever, beaten by the police because they want a deal and they want an end to the war that Douglas and Natasha so proudly support. They keep telling us about the horrors of October the 7th. I agree. This side shares the revulsion against the horrors of October the 7th, but we also share revulsion against the horrors that came since October the 7th. We don't support those horrors. I'm opposed to the war crimes that happened on October the 7th and the war crimes that have happened since October the 7th. Douglas, no, I've got to finish this point. Douglas, the week after October the 7th, came out in The Spectator and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. He said now is
not true.
You said now is a good time to do it.
Everyone can read the piece other than Mehdi.
Rudyard, I'm going to ask to respond to that because it's clear Mehdi didn't listen to a single word that I said. I was talking about UN statistics that show that out of the 3,000 terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October, 3/4 of them would have been educated in the UNRWA school system. I didn't even start to talk about the complicity of UNRWA in the terrorist atrocities themselves, and that has been well documented. But on the education point, I commend the work of Impact SE that's looked at Palestinian Authority textbooks. I commend the work of UN Watch that has outed the UNRWA chats on Telegram in which the attacks were both supported and celebrated, and the identities of those UNRWA employees that took part in them. There are NGOs doing important work to clear the realities of what it is that the opposition seem to be blind to, but that also includes this absolutely abhorrent allegation of war crimes. It's another blood libel. So was occupation, by the way, but we can come on to that, I'm sure, a little bit later.
Wow.
War crimes invokes international law, and I'm going to take the prerogative as the lawyer on the stage to talk about what Israel is doing that surpasses international humanitarian law in Gaza, the principles that it upholds of proportionality, distinction, necessity, and precaution. No other army gives the sorts of warnings before strikes that Israel provides through text messages, phone calls, leaflets to individual householders, a proportionality analysis on strikes that does not launch them when civilians are in the way, and that plays into the hands of Hamas's strategy of using civilians as human shields, another Hamas strategy that is being supported by the opposition tonight with its propaganda.
Thank you. Okay, Douglas, we got a little air time for Douglas here. And Douglas, I know you're going to want to say your piece, but I want you to address something else because I want to move on to college campuses. This has been a big part of this debate. There have been, as we know, chants on college campuses. I'll say them, they're not pretty. There's only one solution, Intifada revolution. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, the probably better known of the two. What does college campuses and what's happening on college campuses here in North America, Douglas, say about this debate right now?
Well, it says that a young generation has been lied to in significant numbers and with a sense of ferocity and extremism, which we should all abhor. I mean, it's possible that these college campus kids didn't get the memo from the other side in their desperate attempt not only to reframe anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism. It's very strange to me, isn't it, that if anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitic, why do all these kids who've never protested about anything else before in the world stage suddenly turn up at Columbia and chase Jewish students with "Go back to Poland" or Ukraine? Why is it Jewish students at universities here in Toronto and Montreal who get chased by mobs and shouted down by mobs screaming anti-Semitic slurs? They're not even bothering to cover over it. I mean, they very rarely anymore remember to say, "Oh, I meant Zionist." They're revealing themselves all the time, and it's because, first of all, they've been lied to. Secondly, there are a very large number of them who are, I would say that they fall into two categories: the sinister and the silly. The sinister are the ones who know exactly which river they're chanting about and exactly which sea. And they want the eradication of the world's only Jewish state. And they think they're the good guys. The silly, they're the ones who, like, there was a guy at Columbia who started this academic year calling for climate emergency, and then Hamas attacked Israel, and suddenly he was for Hamas. He has a sort of belly button piercing, and I think he's queers for Palestine, or let's say chickens for KFC. And these students are, I'll put it straight, they are desperate for a cause. They're desperate for meaning in their lives. They have searched and scoured the land looking for meaning and purpose, and instead of learning something good to do with their lives, they've decided they will do this incredibly simplistic thing. Everything in the world is oppressor, oppressed, occupier, occupied, colonizer, colonized. And this incredibly simplistic idea that works nowhere, they then implant or try to implant over the world's most complex region. And they think in doing so that they're being good guys. And what they don't realize is that if they got what they wanted, they'd have finished the work of Adolf Hitler.
Because I know it's something you've thought a lot about too.
Douglas earlier was telling us all about the importance of journalism going on the ground. While Douglas was getting awards from the President of Israel, we were actually reporting, my news organization Zeteo, from those campuses with Jewish students. In fact, the most read piece on our site is from a student called Jonathan Ben Menachem, who is at Columbia and reported from inside the encampment where they were having a Seder, where he was protesting war crimes in Gaza, which I know the other side thinks there are no war crimes, everything we just imagined the last 8 months. What you have to tackle tonight, I'm glad we brought up college campuses, because again, if this ridiculous sweeping motion, Douglas says complexity, we are the side of complexity, we're not the ones saying anti-Zionism across the board is anti-Semitism, you have to deal with the fact that college protests are disproportionate. There are a disproportionate number of Jews in these protests. They're all brainwashed, they're all idiots, they're all self-haters. Some of the top academics at Columbia University who are Jewish have come out to defend the protests. Annalise Orlek is a 65-year-old former chair of Jewish studies at Dartmouth. She was beaten on camera by police while she was protesting against the war in Gaza. Apparently Douglas, an atheist, says that she's an anti-Semite. That's the debate, that's what we've got to tonight, where the former chair of Jewish studies at Dartmouth is an anti-Semite, while Douglas is the champion of the Jewish people. I find it bizarre, and I'm glad we've brought up college protests, because it's the number one evidence right now in our discourse that actually a lot of young Jewish people, and by the way, this whole argument, why didn't you protest Sudan, why didn't you protest Syria? Last time I checked, the United States Congress does not fund Bashar al-Assad or the RSF militias in Sudan. So stop with this lazy whataboutism that gives you...
They do fund your friends in Tehran.
The US Congress funds Tehran.
You know very well Biden's package for Tehran.
What?
You don't know about it?
US funds Iran. Okay, you got me there, Douglas.
Wow.
By the way, since
Biden decided to bring Iran back into JCPOA, they are no longer under the sanctions that they were, and they've been brought back into the fold. Ergo, they end up with international funding.
America is funding Iran like it funds Israel. This is absurd. By the way, just on fact checks, Natasha gave us a lecture about she's the lawyer on stage. That's true, you are the lawyer on stage. But literally, the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court has asked for arrest warrants. And you're booing again. I know you don't like it, but by the way, the advisor to the ICC chief prosecutor is a man named Theodore Meron, 94 years old, Holocaust survivor, former advisor to the Israeli foreign minister. He advised the ICC to ask for arrest warrants. But according to Douglas and Natasha tonight, and many of you, he's an anti-Semite too. Theodore Meron's an anti-Semite. Let's just keep the list going tonight till we vote tonight as to how many Jews we're going to call an anti-Semite tonight.
Gideon, you're up.
I will be one of them, obviously.
Of course. You're Hamas too, Gideon, don't forget.
I want to a little bit calm down and speak for a moment about anti-Semitism. Where were the anti-Semites and the campuses when Israel went for peace in the Oslo years? How come that the world hugged Israel then? From coast to coast, from continent to continent, campuses and others hugged Israel because Israel went for peace. Now when we look backwards, obviously we see it was a kind of a trap, but let's put it aside. Where was anti-Semitism then? What, anti-Semitism went to sleep when Israel is doing the right thing? Anti-Semitism goes to sleep when Israel is following the international law. Anti-Semitism goes to sleep when Israel is following the resolutions of all the international institutions. It just wakes up if Israel doesn't. So if so, let's ask ourselves, what is the contribution of Israel's policy to the increase of anti-Semitism in the world? There is anti-Semitism in the world. It should be fought without any compromises, no doubt about this. But the manipulation of Israel to label any criticism as anti-Semitism makes a damage to the fight against anti-Semitism. Because the genuine anti-Semitism we should fight. But the critics of Israel, part of them are anti-Semites, part of them are using what's happening to express anti-Semitism. And part of them, let me tell you, a big part of them, are people of conscience, are people that not only have the right to criticize Israel, they have the duty to do so.
Okay, Gideon, that's it. The important point, we're going to register that. I'm going to come to Douglas briefly, and then Natasha, I've got a question for you.
First of all, again, nobody on this side has said or would say that if you criticize any politician in Israel or any action of the Israeli government, you are therefore an anti-Semite. Neither of us said that at any point. Secondly, at no point on this side have we said that this is a zero-sum game between the Israelis and the Palestinians or the Israelis and the Arabs. There is no reason why a Jewish state should not be able to live side by side with another Arab-Palestinian state. Okay? And I'm glad that Gideon brought up Oslo, the only reason that there is not a Palestinian state today, not the Palestinian Authority, which runs most of the West Bank, or Hamas, that was given the Gaza and then decided to do, well, we know what they decided to do with 18 years of international funding from this country and others. Not that, but if they were given another state, there is no reason, if they brought their children up to love life and to live by their neighbors, if they educated their children into learning instead of hate, there is no reason why they could not live in a state beside a Jewish state. And there's no reason why Zionism opposes that. And it doesn't. But once again, Gideon and Mehdi said something without giving you the context. You said that when Israel was involved in Oslo, the world loved it. Well, we all have our different histories and interpretations of that, I'm sure. Maybe it just looks better in the rearview mirror. The reality is that the Oslo process massively changed Israel. Why? Because the Israeli public and their politicians went for peace and they got intifada. They went for peace and they got suicide bombers at nightclubs in Tel Aviv. And one reason why Gideon is such an extremely rare voice in Israel, and congratulations, Mehdi, you know the drill, you can always find a Jew on your side who'll support what you do. But the reason why Gideon is such an unusual voice in Israel is because most Israelis learned from that intifada what it means, what the teaching of hate to Palestinian children means, and now, after October the 7th, they've learned it 1,000-fold. The people who were killed in the communities beside Gaza were people who dreamed of peace just as much as you do, if not more. And I can tell you that of the young people dancing at the Nova party that night, that morning, The young people dancing at that party, massacred, raped, shot, kidnapped for the crime of dancing. There's not one of those kids who didn't dream of the day they could dance with their Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Okay, Gideon, you got to be brief here because Natasha's up next.
Sure. I don't know what, they shouldn't have been killed in any case. If they dreamed about peace or didn't dream about peace, they shouldn't have been killed, no doubt about this. But to put Israel today as a peace-loving country, really, something must have some borders. I mean, where shall we stop? We can say everything about Israel and believe everything about Israel. When Israel, you just mentioned the two-state solution. Wonderful solution. Why are there 700,000 settlers there if you want to give it back? Why did you put 700 settlers? Out of peace. And I want you to tell you one more thing. Each of you, I don't know you, unfortunately, maybe I'll get to know you tonight. I can get your mood. Each of you, ask yourself, if you would have been born Palestinian and live all your life under the brutal, maybe the most brutal regime today in the world. I saw it. When you would wake up in the morning and see your parents beaten and go to sleep at night and troops will come to your home and kidnap your father or your mother in front of your eyes on a daily basis, and I know what I'm talking about. Don't tell me about facts, yeah? What do you think you would have felt toward the people who does it to you? What do you think? It has nothing to do with education system. They don't need education system to hate us.
Okay,
we make them hating us.
We've got the point. I appreciate it. We've got a little bit of time left here. I want to try to squeeze in a couple more topics, and you guys are going to circle back, I'm sure, but we're going to try to soldier on together. Natasha, you've thought a lot about international organizations, and they've come up in this debate a few times already. One of the features, the longstanding historical features of anti-Semitism has been to blame Jews for actions that they themselves are the victims of. How do you see this? Let's hear your argument to how you think this is unfolding right now in international organizations and why you think they are emblematic of this new anti-Semitism operating under the guise of anti-Zionism.
Well, this comes down to the core of lawfare. This not such a new practice. It's been with us for several decades already. But it's an abuse of international law. And I think you're right that international legal institutions are being abused for the pursuit of a political agenda in which these outlandish, malicious allegations, it's worse than victim blaming, of course, because here you're blaming the victims of the crime that was committed against them. And South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice alleging genocide is part and parcel of that. It should be noted that there is a reason South Africa made that allegation, not because it has any factual or legal basis, but because it serves as a legal hook to bring Israel to the court. Israel is a signatory to the Genocide Convention. And in fact, the Genocide Convention has always been of particular import for Israel. The term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin after the Holocaust to provide a legal lexicon to that experience of the Jewish people, that intentional eradication of a people, intentional destruction in whole or in part. That is what genocide means. Think about that when you hear allegations from the opposition of that order. There are a couple of points that I do want to pick up. I mean, Douglas has explained the context of Oslo and the sort of extreme statements that we've had already from the other side in that respect. But picking up on Oslo and also the conspiracy theories that were mooted that the Israeli government was in some way complicit in the 7th of October. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are significant causes of the 7th that we do need to take into account, not least international pressure on Israel to make security concessions. I mean, we're talking about generations of Israelis who have seen every concession they make lead to blood on the streets. Those who went to make peace in Oslo were met with an intifada. The withdrawal from Gaza gave us a terror statelet. But what people don't seem to realize is that between January and August last year, there were some 400,000 entrances from Gaza into Israel. Douglas spoke about the people of the South seeking cooperation, coexistence with their neighbors in the Gaza Strip. Those entrances, 400,000 of them, were mostly on work permits. People who came to work in the kibbutzim and the moshavim in the South, work in the agricultural centers, work in the houses, build together with the communities there. Many of them gathered intelligence for the 7th of October. The terrorists, when they crossed the border, they carried manuals which listed house by house how many people, whether there were children, was there a dog in the house, was there a gun, and what they were instructed to do to each of those families. Security concessions made in the name of seeking peace, which has been Israel's story from the very outset. When David Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, he stretched out his hand to the Arab population and said, let us build this country together. And that war of annihilation was launched on Israel almost immediately.
And kicked out 600,000 Palestinians and erased all the villages.
Well, let's deal with that point head on.
Natasha,
there has been...
In fairness of time and what's remaining on the clock, just quickly wrap this up.
There's been a great deal of literature debunking those false claims. In particular, a recent book on the myth of Deir Yassin, which I commend to the audience. And I think we're looking at a parallel issue here of history being subverted to promote a particular narrative that is not in keeping.
We appreciate that point. We're just going to. Mehdi, I know you want to respond to that, but I want you to also offer defense of international institutions at this moment as it relates to holding the state of Israel to account.
I have just one sentence to say about that, is that the entire world wants a ceasefire, and the United States and Israel and, I don't know, the Micronesia and whatever else don't, right? The entire world takes a very different view, unfortunately, to the people in this room and to Douglas and Natasha. The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UNHCR, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Christian Aid. Yep, you're booing. What does it come to when you're booing Oxfam? What does that tell you about yourselves? You're sitting here booing Oxfam to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me just deal with something you just said. You talked about debunking propaganda. First of all, you can't even get Israeli propaganda straight. The Israeli government's own security agency, Shin Bet, investigated what you just said and said, no, we found no evidence that workers from Gaza were involved in the October 7th attack. Oh, Shin Bet are lying. They're booing Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. Got it. All right, let me finish my point. You had a 5-minute speech from your side. Okay. That's Shin Bet. Let me just deal with your wider point here. Douglas and Natasha tonight want to make this entire debate about October 7th. I get it. It's a horror show. But that's not the debate. The debate was about Zionism, and it tells you a lot that they can't find any arguments to say, as Gideon says, why we can't be allowed to criticize a political ideology that is 150 years old, that many Jewish people have criticized from the beginning and continue to do so. They can't tell you why that is. So they focus on October the 7th, which is fine, but if you're going to focus on October 7th, then also focus on what happened since October the 7th, the erasure of Palestinians in this debate, the booing when Gideon mentions what happened to Palestinians. Shameful. I'm sorry to say, it's absolutely shameful and telling about what's going on. And I would say this, if we're going to talk about October 7th and what happened since, everyone's a liar, the Hamas health ministry is a liar, everyone's a liar. Okay, friend of mine, American doctor, goes to Gaza. Many doctors have gone to Gaza. You've seen them on the news, they're all liars, all Hamas apparently. Friend of mine went to Gaza. He's been to Sudan. He doesn't just use it for whataboutism like Douglas. He's been to Sudan. He's been to Afghanistan. He's worked there. He came back from Gaza and said, I've never seen atrocities like I've seen here. What's happened to children? He's an anti-Semite because he saw children with burn wounds like he's never seen. He saw children with gunshot wounds to the head. To the head, but that's Hamas's fault. Everything is Hamas's fault. So let's talk about war crimes. It is amazing that every human rights group in the world, including Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, Gisha, Yeshdin, are all documenting this stuff, but you guys think it's all imaginary. So again, it tells you about what Zionism is. This is not about some abstract ideology of, people trying to settle the land and trying to have it. But as Gideon said, there was an argument to be had in the 1940s, 30s, 20s. Zionism today is what the Palestinians are enduring on a daily, nightly basis in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Israel itself. And the erasure of that tells you everything about why we need to be able to talk about what Zionism does to the Palestinians without being smeared as anti-Semites.
Okay. Douglas?
First of all, Again, you should do the reporting yourself, Mehdi. I've seen the maps on the bodies of the terrorists. I've seen, for instance, the one of the bodies of the terrorists.
Shin Bet is
well, no, you're just trying to make a cheap debating point again.
No, it's called a fact.
Let me make the point, which instead of you making your cheap debating point, is a fact which you should think of imbibing. Just stop it for a moment, Mehdi, and listen.
Please, go. Come on. Give us your facts.
I'll give you one example. The terrorists who came into Ofakim, which is many miles from the border, on the bodies of the 12 terrorists who made it into that settlement, into that community there, in Ofakim, I have seen the map on the body of at least one of the terrorists, and it had on the map the house of a member of the Knesset who lived there, the house where the synagogue was going to be because it was a holy day, and the kindergarten. Now, I'll give you one other example. In Near Oz, excuse me, because you lied again. Because you lied again and pretended that what Natasha just said was not the case. And I am telling you...
what Shin Bet says.
No, you're not, Mehdi.
As
usual, you're making a cheap point for your partisan reasons. And I am telling you...
You've accused me of being Hamas, but I'm the chief debater.
I have seen the precise maps of the communities I'm afraid I am.
I'm afraid
more reliable than you and your bosses in Qatar.
I'm afraid you're not, Douglas. Oh, my boss is in Qatar, not cheap debating. Douglas, you're the guy... let's just be clear. You're the guy who denied earlier that what you said in The Spectator... Let's just be the clear context. We're talking about October 7th. 5 days after October 7th, you said, maybe they will finally put an end to this insoluble nightmare, raise Hamas to the ground, or clear all the Palestinians from that benighted strip. It could be a good time to do it, but you tell this audience we can live in peace side by side. That's a war crime. No. Ethnic cleansing is a war crime. Not at all. Clearing people.
No, I said maybe for a reason.
It could be a good time to do it.
For goodness sake.
Douglas, just apologize and move on.
Brilliant.
Seriously.
Talking about moving on, we are now going to move on to closing statements because the time for this portion of the debate has come to a close. We're going to approach those statements in the opposite order of the openings, 4 minutes each. So, Gideon, this time, you're the only time in the debate you get to go first. Take us away with your closing statement.
I would love to have the last word, but I never get it. That's fine. I guess I don't deserve it. I would like really in a different tone now, because we are concluding soon. I'm the only one here who lives in Israel, who was born in Israel, who raises his children in Israel, who never had a slightest idea of leaving Israel, who will never leave Israel as long as I will not be forced to leave Israel. All my life I live in Israel. Part of my life I was a Zionist. Part of my life I was struggling, because it's not very easy to get released from something that you get from childhood in quantities that I can't even explain you how much propaganda goes to our veins and how much blindness goes to our veins toward other side of Israel. And Israel has so many good sides. Don't tell me about them. I know very well, and I know to appreciate it very well. And in many things, I have very hard time to live in Israel, to be an Israeli. Many times I'm deeply ashamed of being an Israeli, more and more so. Few times I feel proud of being Israeli, less and less so. And gradually, after covering the occupation for decades now, after covering the crimes which were never denied by no one, none of my stories was ever denied, but everyone can say whatever he wants. After so many years, I realized that the only way to get out of this deadlock, and nobody can deny here that Israel is right now in its worst position ever, a pariah state par excellence. You may blame the whole world for it, but maybe we Israelis should also look upon ourselves and ask, maybe we did something wrong. Can it be that we didn't do any mistakes, any crimes, and the whole world is anti-Semitic? The Supreme Court of this kind and the Supreme Court of this kind, this forum and this forum, intellectuals, artists, everyone. Can it be that all are anti-Semites and only we are pure and just forever? So we have to look with some kind of decency at the mirror and ask ourselves, but that's really our problem as Israelis. Most of the Israelis are still convinced, according to the propaganda lines that we heard here today, are not ready to take any criticism and become very, very aggressive if you dare to criticize them from time to time. I dare to suggest to my fellow Israelis, maybe the Israeli IDF, the Israeli army, is not the most moral army in the world, but the second moral army in the world. You know, after 40,000 victims in 8 months, maybe they are the second after the army of Luxembourg. They become offensive. How dare you say so? So really, because time is running out, the only thing which is today to be decided in this respectable forum is, do we have the right to criticize Israel without being criminalized, without being silenced, without being labeled as anti-Semites? And believe me, for the benefit of Israel, we better stand in front of the challenges, the criticism of genuine friends, instead of trying to silence them. Because this propaganda campaign of silencing any critic will, by the end of the day, be the best source for new anti-Semitism. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, for a great debate. We appreciated you coming from Israel to be part of this event tonight. Natasha Hausdorff, 4 minutes on the clock. Your closing statement, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot about freedom of speech this evening, and I think it's important to clarify that Douglas and I aren't here to silence anyone. We're just here for the proper identification of what we've been hearing from the opposition, and that is anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And let me be clear, I do not blame the whole world for the venomous hatred that Israel is currently being subject to. I blame the opposition and the blood libels that they have peddled in this evening. Gideon began with a statement of his credentials. Perhaps I should do the same. I sit in front of you as the granddaughter of Palestinians. Living under the British, they had identity cards issued to them that identified them as Palestinians, nationals of the British Mandate. Think on that the next time you hear people trying to revise history and tell you what Palestinians are today and suggest that that is equivalent to what existed before the State of Israel was formed. We have heard hostility to the State of Israel from the moment that Gideon got up. The suggestion that a gathering like this would be out of place in the Jewish state is preposterous. I've attended many myself. And you have the most rigorous, robust debate imaginable in Israel. More so, I would suggest, than anywhere in the world. But if the opposition really cared about Palestinians in the way that they profess, they would be calling, as I do, for Egypt to comply with its international law obligations, those that it signed up to in the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it acceded to in 1980, Egypt's responsibility to allow safe passage for refugees fleeing civil disorder in Gaza. Israel has gone above and beyond, and other modern militaries frequently say we wouldn't be able to meet the standards that Israel sets in the precautions that it takes. But it has had to move those civilians, or encourage them to move, it doesn't control them, to evacuate, to provide humanitarian corridors. When you think of the ease with which those civilians could be properly provided for the other side of the border with Egypt in Egyptian Rafah, where the aid that Israel is facilitating into the Gaza Strip wouldn't be diverted and stolen by Hamas, where aid workers would be able to assist them without being targeted by Hamas. I haven't heard any of that from the opposition today, and that is another reason that I say to you, what they are putting forward, the blood libels that they are peddling in, is anti-Zionism. And we also saw it in that comment from Gideon, give it back, referring to the West Bank. It's the settlers, the settlers. That call for the West Bank or Judea and Samaria to be Jew-free, as so much of the rest of the Arab world, Judenrein, we've heard that before, ladies and gentlemen. We were told because Jews in the 20th century differed about whether the creation of the State of Israel was a good idea, that was a reason that Jews couldn't be anti-Semitic if they were anti-Zionist. Well, I urge you to consider a debate between parents, which might be entirely legitimate as to whether or not to have a child. There may be arguments for and against, reasonable ones. But once that child is born, to suggest that it should be gotten rid of would be murder. That is what we have heard advocated by the opposition today. And so I ask you, if you are, as Israel, liberals, care about peace, and abhor racism, you will stand with the proposition this evening.
Mehdi Hasan, let's have your closing.
Ladies and gentlemen, before we finish that, I do want to say, look, I get it. I do. I get it. Anti-Semitism is undeniably on the rise. Hate crimes are on the rise. Ancient tropes and conspiracy theories are back in circulation. No one is denying that. And so Jewish people, understandably, feel unsafe, threatened, insecure. So we should take a stand. I've said this for years. Take a stand against anti-Semitism, all of us. But this isn't it. This is not it. This motion is not it. I'm sorry to say, this motion is an attempt to play you, to manipulate you, to gaslight you by propagandists and apologists for Israel's current government. In fact, this motion could have been written by the Israeli government. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just back in 1973, Israel's own foreign minister, Abba Eban, said the quiet part out loud. It began over 50 years ago. He said, and I quote, "One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism," he said. So this attempt, there's nothing new about this attempt to define a new anti-Semitism, even while the old anti-Semitism from Douglas's end of the political spectrum is flourishing right now. We have a Republican presidential candidate who is a card-carrying anti-Semite who hosts Holocaust deniers for dinner, but we don't hear about that. We have far-right militias on the rise right now across North America. We don't hear about that. Just a few years ago, the biggest massacre of Jews in North American history took place in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the shooter was not a left-wing anti-Zionist, it was a right-wing anti-Semite. We didn't talk tonight in this debate about the anti-Semitic threat being posed by the rise of far-right parties in Europe, where the Israeli press says this is good for Israel. Wow, I remember a time when the rise of far-right parties wasn't good for Jewish people, but it's good for Israel and its right-wing government, for Ben Gvir, for Smotrich, for Netanyahu. We don't talk about the threat posed by Viktor Orban, openly anti-Semitic leader in Europe. If I wanted to make a cheap debating point, I'd say that's because he's a fan of Douglas and Douglas is a fan of his, but I won't make that cheap debating point. We don't talk about that stuff. And ladies and gentlemen, look, even if you ascribe the best of intentions to the proposition side tonight, and spoiler alert, I don't. This entire debate is a distraction, a deflection, an attempt to make you look over here, not over there. There being Gaza, where they don't get to have protests on college campuses because the most moral army in the world wiped out 12 college campuses in Gaza. There being the West Bank, where a record number of children have been killed since October the 7th, even though the West Bank is not run by Hamas. There being Israel, where a government of self-proclaimed fascists and racists faces nightly protests from thousands of Jewish Israelis, including the families of hostages. But no, don't look over there. Look over here. Embrace this pernicious idea that those of us who oppose the way in which Israel was created, or what Israel has become, or how Israel treats its Palestinian minority, we're all somehow bigots, racists, anti-Jewish, even the Jews among us, like Gideon. Because remember, that is the motion tonight, not whether you support Israel or Zionism, which is fine, but whether the rest of us who don't are automatically anti-Semitic. By the way, what a weird and bizarre situation we find ourselves in tonight in Toronto, where we've had a British atheist of Christian descent, a non-Jew, telling the Jewish grandson of Holocaust victims who lives in Israel that he's an anti-Semite. What a bizarre debate. Tells you everything. Because he opposes the governing ideology of Israel. Think about how absurd that is. Think about how offensive that is. And then ask yourself the question, Why would you vote for that? Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to vote against this flawed, false, and truly dangerous motion. Vote for free speech and common sense.
Thank you, Mehdi Hassan. Okay, Douglas, as per convention, the pro side of the debate gets the last word. You're up, 4 minutes on the clock.
Well, thank you very much. Quite a lot of heat, some light. We set out this evening defining what both these terms were, and they are defined for you. Anti-Semitism is a cruel treatment, double standards applied to Jews. Anti-Zionism is a movement that believes that the Jews don't have the right to a state in their historic homeland. And as I said at the beginning, anti-Semitism is a shapeshifter. It does come from all sorts of directions, and Mehdi is right. As I mentioned at the beginning, it can come from the far right, it can come from the far left. But at the moment, what we see an eruption of is anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. What else is it that is motivating the crowds? Why, when I was in Vancouver the other month, were there crowds going down the street in Vancouver screaming about Israel? What's it got to do with them? You're miles away. It's got absolutely into the brains of people in the West who believe they're doing something moral, and they are imbibing every anti-Semitic trope, as Natasha has proven. I should say, since Mehdi was honest, I'll say what I think. I think he's a very dishonest actor. A very dishonest actor. And to say what you just said about hostages would come a lot better if a contributor to Al Jazeera had not been discovered last week holding a hostage in his home. It would be a lot easier to take. And finally, I just want to say this. It's perfectly obvious, as I said at the beginning, that you can get anti-Semitism from all directions. This just happens to be the major direction which is coming in at the moment, in the guise of anti-Zionism. As I said, does everybody who is doing this know what they're doing? No. Almost certainly not. To some of them, oh, you bet. They're having a whale of a time. People like those people I mentioned marching last week through Jewish areas of Toronto, getting to scream about the pigs and the rats again. Wow, it feels good to them. Does everyone know what they're doing? No. But when you hear Gideon saying that, what did you say earlier? That Israel is the most brutal regime in the world, you can have traveled nowhere, sir. And there is no reason, as I said at the beginning of this tonight, why simply recognizing that the anti-Zionism of today is anti-Semitism should be any barrier to there being some kind of peace settlement at some point. But please understand that those of us who recognize that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is because we see, after a mass slaughter of Jews, the world turning on the one Jewish state. That is what we see and what we worry about, and what some people like Mehdi seem not to care about, and all of the smears and all of the lies that they get to pump out. But I've got good news for you, ladies and gentlemen, to finish. I hope very much that you vote the right way tonight, obviously. And it matters for Canada and its image. But the Jewish state and the Jewish people have survived an awful lot worse than this. They have seen off every single one of their enemies, from Pharaoh to the Abyssinians, to the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. They will see off Hamas, they will see off Mehdi, and they will outlive everybody in this room.
Statements for a great debate. And I just want to, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our debaters for the civility, the substance, the rigor, the analysis. And again, some people thought this debate would do more harm than good. I think it's certainly been a fruitful hour and a half together. And now you get an opportunity to join the debate because we're going to vote a second time on the motion this evening. So your vote pads have two options. One, A, if you are in favor of the motion, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Or 3, the numeral 3, which is beside the letter C, if you are opposed. As these results build, we're going to give you a little bit of time to make sure you get your vote in. We're going to take a quick look at how public opinion began in this room tonight. So we'll put those results up on the screen just to remind us how we came into this debate. Front screen, sorry. Vote number 1, 61% in favor of the motion, 39% opposed. Let's look at how many of you were going to possibly change your mind when it came to the vote tonight. You'll see that again on the screens behind. 77%, that was our second vote, could change their mind. So the debate was very much in play. 23% of you were made up, roughly a quarter. So has everyone had a chance to vote? You've all got your vote in. Okay, let's see if we have some numbers for you. They're building them right now. We're going to show those up on the second screen. So the second row of screens. Let's see the new vote coming in. 66% in favor of the motion, 34% opposed. So Douglas and Natasha, congratulations for arguing successfully for tonight's motion. Thank you, Gideon and Mehdi, for an admirable argument for the con side. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this debate tonight. To Sherry Naylor, our organizer, Ricky Gurowitz, our managing producer. We'll do this all again in the fall. Good night.